science, it is based on a quantification of these fair shares and a recognition that it is not enough for these rich countries to reach domestic real zero emissions within their own country in order to account for their historical fair share. They need to finance a large part of these mitigation efforts in the South. And therefore, when we're talking about phasing out of fossil fuels in the South, which will cost a lot for us, as has been expressed by Sandra, there will be a lot of lost revenues, for instance, a lot of replacement that needs to be done for fossil fuel energy because our people will need energy. In fact, the ramping up of renewable energy in the South has to be faster than the phase out of fossil fuels because there's a lot of energy poverty in the South that needs to be addressed through renewable energy. So we're emphasizing that the delivery of climate finance is not because we need it or that we need assistance. This is something owed to us in the South. This is something that needs to be done because it's part of the obligations and fair shares of developed countries and wealthy governments. Now, we cannot accept their argument that there's not enough public funds. So what they're trying to do now, and this is one of the sticky points in these COP negotiations, is shunting over the responsibility to developing countries. You know, for us to look for all sorts of creative ways to raise finance, they said. Or, and this is the biggest argument they're making, to rely on global and domestic finance markets, to private finance in order to finance that energy transition. And we don't accept that argument. One of the first that they need to do, phase out subsidies for fossil fuels in the North and use the funds they will save, which is much, much larger, in fact, than whatever they are giving to climate finance. Use this to deliver on their obligations for climate finance. This is not enough because we're also talking about trillions. They should tax the super rich in the global North. There's now going around the world a big push for wealth taxes. Of course, we're not saying that wealth tax collection is just all going to climate. There are so many other needs that must be addressed through the collection of more taxes from the wealthy, from the super billionaires who have earned even more billions during the COVID crisis. But part of it certainly can be used for climate finance. They should reduce, if not completely eliminate, the funding for war and military operations, for military hardware, for the bombs that they are now raining on Gaza. They should stop funding this military and shift the finance to fossil fuels. To climate finance and the energy transition. And we're not saying this is part of climate finance. Let me just make this very clear. We are calling for the cancellation of the debt because we have our own justice arguments why these debts need to be canceled, why we don't owe them, they in fact owe us. There's over $1 trillion that is a net resource flow from the South to the North happening every year. We have paid that debt many times over through interest payments, through the lives and damages to our communities and our ecologies. They must cancel the debt, but that should not be counted as part of their climate finance obligations. And may I just reiterate, no more loan financing, because what they're talking about, including ramping up, enlarging the role of the multilateral development banks to deliver on this climate finance, is more loans for the South. So we're very clear that we cannot rely on private sector and private capital and markets, and we do not want loans for climate finance, especially not for loss and damage, not for adaptation, but also for renewable energy, because our governments, for this to happen successfully, the phase out of fossil fuels and the development of renewable energy systems, our governments need to lead this process to make it succeed, and they need public funds to do their obligations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lydia. Lastly, we will go to Shireen Talat, the Director of MetaFem Movement for Economic Development and Ecological Justice.
Thank you, Brennan. And I just want to start with pay us back. pay us back, and we need to understand that there's no climate justice, there's no justice under occupation, there's no justice under apartheid. And adding to what my colleagues already mentioned, there is actually enough public finance to meet our climate needs, but the problem is that this public finance are under an undemocratic governance system, which the global economical architecture system, which is owned only by the North countries, the most wealthy countries, and the problem is the most in need countries doesn't even have a voice under this system. Our countries, for example, I come from Egypt. Egypt, Pakistan, Ukraine pay an extra charge on our debt called surcharge policies that the IMF impose on us. That can be sometimes 100% from the debt itself. And they are asking us to pay our debt bill, which they are burdening us more with this surcharge. For example, Pakistan is paying around 360 million a year. Pakistan just faced a very tremendous ecological crisis. And this is only the beginning. The ecological crisis is evaluating. Morocco in my region faced a very harmful earthquake, and again, that's only the beginning. Starting by stop IMF surcharges, but the problem is the fact that the allocation of the eliminating surcharges are not only enough, but also in their hand they can do more by reallocating or reissuing surcharges. But the problem is the fact that reissuing SDRs, the fact that reissuing SDRs or even reallocating SDRs is backed to the IMF quota system. That means that they are distributing first to those who have the big share, not that need. They distributing it for those who need less. The quota system rooted in a colonial legacies also determine that those same countries that hold the largest voice in the IMF decision making, and that means the global economical architecture system will have the same and their own voice, giving the failure of the IMF quota review to give a greater voice to climate vulnerable countries. We must call for and not only to be ambitious, but it is our right to decide now to change the rules and to create an international alternative to this system. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to open the floor up for questions, and also to say, I think if you have been paying attention in the last few days, you will notice that all of the vision and demands that we are talking about do not quite match up with what is on the table here at COP28. And so in particular, welcome questions on some of the proposals that are either too weak or would do outright harm. And there's a strong vision here. We have the alternatives, and yeah, really we'll be pushing and holding global leaders accountable to these. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, my name is Sharif Jamil. I came from Bangladesh, and last couple of days I have been asked by our journalists came from Bangladesh about the Leaders Summit happened in COP28, and there are some places came up, and how do you feel about it? So that is my question to the panel. How do we feel about it? How do you see that?
About the recent developments?
Yeah, the recent pledge. I know it is drop in the ocean, but how is that?
Yeah, I think Sharif is referring to the pledges that are coming on board after they gavelled the loss and damage fund. And as you said, these are peanuts. The pledges are coming up to only a few $100 million. In fact, the U.S., if I recall, is only $17 million, which is really an insult because it is actually, after all, per capita still the biggest polluter in the world. So we are now monitoring because they said there will be more pledges. But this is just for the loss and damage. And we're now talking that they need to also deliver on climate finance in general to include mitigation and adaptation. And the United States has not delivered anything thus far to the Green Climate Fund for a few years now. And in fact, they even had to backtrack on the earlier pledges that they have made. So the situation is really appalling. I was at the high-level plenary discussion at the Global Stocktake on means of implementation yesterday morning, and the parties, presidents and prime ministers were speaking. One appalling thing is after they speak, they leave the room. They're not interested to hear anyone else. They just are there to speak, and no concrete pledges.
Just quickly add to that in a minute. I mean, the first day when they announced the loss and damage fund, I mean, most of us celebrated and enjoyed and ululated. Some of us were even almost going back home because we felt we've won, right? But the reason why we're here, ladies and gentlemen, is because of the climate crisis that we're in. And so far, the only way that this COP can be successful and we can say we've won is when they say when they're going to be phasing out fossil fuels and when they're going to be phasing up renewable energies.
Thank you, and we'll go over here.
Hi, my name is Megan Redding. I'm a journalist. I work for Thomson Reuters. The question is about just energy transition partnerships, which is basically so far the answer from a lot of donor countries to this necessity to increase renewable energy, phase out fossil fuels in the countries that have won these JETPs so far. What's your view on those instruments, and where do you see, if there were to be a more kind of equitable form of access to this type of finance, where should it be coming from, and do we need something like a Just Transition Fund? Hesitate to add another fund, but within the UNFCCC. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Definitely, as we heard yesterday, there is this pledge to increase the renewable energy and as well as energy efficiency. These partnerships are important, but let's not miss the big picture. These JPs are going to be very important to transit, but it's very important to see how they are going to be implemented. And this is where the just part comes on board, because we have seen a lot of investments in renewable energy that have been even harmful for a lot of communities at the local level. In the case of Mexico, this is what is happening. So that's why these investments have to come with very high human rights approach, and investors and, let's say, developed countries are not keen to include the human rights perspective. So that's why we have to be very careful in how we support these JPs, which is important. We will need it to invest in renewable energy, but I also invite you to think in how they are going to invest in our economies to generate our own technology, our own capacity building processes, and not only an imposition of technologies. And as our colleague said, the big message that we want to hear here is not only about increasing renewable energy. It's perfect, it's good, we need it, but the most important part and the biggest signal that we will see here is the reduction and the phase out of fossil fuels and the reduction of the production of fossil fuels ASAP. That's the big message that we want to pursue.
Just to add two quick points. One is what we are already facing in reality. For instance, the JETP in Indonesia, a lot of the finance they're offering is in the form of loans. That's one. The second reality is we have to fight off proposals that are about financing fossil fuel companies as a form of quantitative easement for, shutting down early. So that we need to make sure that this doesn't come out with bailout packages for fossil fuel companies.
I just want to add on the just transition term. Just transition, to be just, means it needs to be determined by the communities themselves. Just transition in Morocco is different than just a transition in Kenya. So we need to understand what the community needs. And between brackets, and it's very important to highlight, renewable energies is not another phase of colonialism. We need to own our resources, stop extracting our resources under the name of renewables. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are out of time, but welcome journalists or others to meet us outside for any further questions. Thank you.